In this section, we get to know the Amazon AWS Elastic Beanstalk service. We are going to build a WordPress website, and we are going to use the Elastic Beanstalk service to automate the process. So let's have a quick introduction. In this video, we are going to launch a web stack to host the famous CMS WordPress using Elastic Beanstalk and Amazon Relational Database Service, or RDS. Let's start by defining what Elastic Beanstalk service is. It is a service that is offered by AWS that is used to automate building complex infrastructures. Let's see how. What does it take to build a web application? First, you might need one or more EC2 instances, depending on how complex your application is and how much load you are expecting. Additionally, you also need a web server installed on this EC2 instance. Of course, this also needs an operating system to be installed prior to doing that. Then after installing the operating system and the web server, you will also need a runtime environment. So for example, if you are hosting a WordPress CMS installation, you're going to need to install PHP and configure various settings in order for this to work with your CMS. You will also need to configure the security group. In other words, the firewall that you are going to use for your EC2 instance. You are going to enable port 80, for example, and port 443 to enable your instances to receive traffic. You're going to have to do this on all your EC2 instances. Optionally, you may have to use the SNS, or Simple Notification Service, for creating push notifications, and this of course depends on the type of web application that you are building. And finally, you may need an elastic load balancer on top of your EC2 instances if you want to achieve high availability. You might also need an RDS database instance to hold your data. So as you can see, the environment is becoming more and more complex, and as the level of complexity increases, the error margin also increases. An infrastructure like this will require time and effort from your side. Amazon AWS Elastic Beanstalk service can automate the whole process for you. It is going to create your EC2 instances, load balancers, RDS instances. It will configure the security groups for you, install the web server, the runtime environment, and more. So, what are we going to cover in this section? We are going to do a very simple lab in which we are going to install WordPress using Elastic Beanstalk. We are going to see how we can create an environment on EB and explore the different options of building the stack. Then we are going to actually deploy our WordPress source files on the environment that we have just built. And by the end of the section, we are going to also use a custom domain name so that we can access our WordPress installation using a user-friendly domain name instead of the arbitrary URL that AWS provides for us. Of course, this is going to be done using Route 53 AWS DNS Manager. If you want to create a web application stack on AWS, the process might involve a lot of steps from your side. For example, you will have to spin up an EC2 instance or more. And for each one of those instances, you will have to configure the security groups with the different ports that you want your application to listen at. Then you will have to log into each EC2 instance of those, install the web server, for example, Apache or Nginx, install the programming language like PHP or Python or Node.js, and configure the settings for those applications to work correctly. Fortunately, Amazon has a tool that can orchestrate the whole process and saves you a lot of time and effort. This is Elastic Beanstalk. In this video, we are going to demonstrate how you can deploy a WordPress application using Elastic Beanstalk. So let's get started. The first thing we need to do is create the database that is going to host our WordPress installation. We are going to use, of course, Amazon AWS RDS. So I'm going to click on RDS and I'm going to click on Create Database. This is going to be based on MySQL. You can use, of course, Amazon Aurora if you want to, because it supports MySQL as the backend engine, or MariaDB. All of those are supported by WordPress. And I'm going to click Next. I'm going to choose Dev Test because this is giving me more options. I'm going to click Next. And there is no specific preference for the database engine that is going to work with WordPress. So I'm going to leave it at the default. And I'm going to choose the smallest instance type, which is db2.micro. I'm not going to create a replica in a different zone, and I'm going to enter the instance name, let's say WP DB instance. The master username is going to be root, and I'm going to set the password, and I'm going to click next. I will leave the default VPC. I'm not going to create a new one. And for this specific example, I'm going to leave this setting on public accessibility. This means that I can access this database locally from my terminal, from my laptop. I do not need to connect to an EC2 instance to connect to that database, but don't worry, we are going to limit the access to this database so that only my IP address and connections, okay, and there is no availability zone preference for me here. I'm gonna leave everything at the default, and optionally I can create a database that will get created when the instance is started. Let's call this WordPress DB so that it's gonna hold my WordPress installation, and everything else is going to be just at the defaults. And I'm going to click create database to create the instance, and I'm gonna click all DB instances, databases, click on WPDB instance. It is now creating. In a few moments, it's going to be available. This process might take from a few seconds to several minutes. Right, so now the RDS instance is available. But before I go ahead and connect to it, I'm gonna have to make a very small modification to the security group that it belongs to. I'm gonna click on the security group. By default, the security group that is associated with MySQL will allow connections on port 3306, which is the database port, from the user's IP address. So here I have connections allows from my own IP address. I'm going to take a copy of this security group ID and edit, add rule, MySQL Aurora, and I'm going to paste the security group ID in the source. Click Save. The effect of this change is that this MySQL instance is going to receive connections from my own IP as well as from any AWS connection that is originating from this security group. We're going to see later on why I did this change when we create the Elastic Beanstalk application stack, because I'm going to add all the EC2 instances that will be inside this stack to this security group so that it can connect to the MySQL instance. Now that I made this change, I need to go back to my RDS instance. So let's have a look at the RDS databases, WPDB instance, and I'm going to take a copy of the endpoint. Go to my terminal, and if you want to use Workbench or any MySQL client, that's okay. It's a matter of preference. In this example, I'm going to use the MySQL command line tool to connect to the instance. So it's MySQL -u root for the user, -p to ask me for the password, -h for the host. I'm going to paste the endpoint, and then I'm click enter, type in the password, and click enter again. Now I am inside the database. And I'm going to switch to the database that I have just created, use WordPress DB, and now I need to create a user for WordPress and give it access on this WordPress DB database. The reason why I'm doing this is that otherwise I'm going to have to give WordPress the root username and password to go ahead and create the tables and the objects that it needs for the database, and that is a huge security risk. You never want to give the application administrative permissions on your database. You always have to have a user that only has access to the specific application database, and that is exactly what I'm going to do. I'm going to create a user that is called WordPress by using this SQL statement. And then I'm going to grant all privileges on the database, and then I'm going to grant all privileges on WordPress DB database to this user. Okay, and finally, I will need to apply those privileges immediately, and that's it. Now I have my RDS instance ready. Let's go ahead and create our Elastic Beanstalk application stack. So I'm going to go to Services on the AWS Management Console, and I'm going to type beanstalk.cs to go to Elastic Beanstalk service. Okay, and if you haven't created any environments before, you're gonna see a screen like this one. Let's go to this button, create new application. We'll need to give it a name. Obviously, it's gonna be WordPress. I can say app. Can add an optional description here, and then click on create. And the application will have an environment. You can have multiple environments for an application. We are going to create one for this stack. So I'm going to click on create one now. I'm going to choose web server environment because this is the one that's best suited for our use case. And then I'm going to click select. Now here we have several options that we need to have a look at. The first one is the environment name. The environment name, of course, is derived from the application name. It's WordPress app-inf. I'm going to leave that. I can change that name, but I'm going to leave it. I can optionally choose a domain name to be associated with this environment and to be used to access this environment and to be used to access this web application from the browser. But since we are already going to associate this environment later on with Route 53, we are going to have our own custom domain name, so no need to add one here. We can just let AWS choose our domain for us. Then in the base configuration, you will need to choose the platform that this application is going to be based on. As you can see here, we have multiple application languages and runtime environments, like for example, .NET, Go, Java, Node, Ruby, Python, PHP, and so on. For this specific example, and since we are going to build a WordPress application, I'm going to choose PHP. In the coming video, we are going to actually upload our WordPress PHP source files and continue with configuring our Elastic Beanstalk environment.